Hello Year 12s and welcome to this video on Porter's Generic Strategies approach. In fact, this is the first of two videos on Porter's Generic Strategies approach. In this video, I will describe the theory underlying Porter's Generic Strategies approach and give you a brief introduction to Porter's Generic Strategies. However, most of this video will be devoted to explaining the process that a business uses to determine which of Porter's generic strategies the business should adopt. As you will see, this process consists of 3 steps, with the second step applying what is called a 5-force analysis. In the second video, we will look in more detail at 2 of Porter's generic strategies. These are lower cost and differentiation. There are 4 things that you need to do while you're watching this video. First, take the very best Cornell notes that you can. Second, use the pause and rewind functions. Use the pause function if you need to stop this video so that you can take notes. Use the rewind function if you need to go over any information contained in this video. The third thing that you need to do is have your summary books open in front of you. I will indicate on the relevant slides the information that you should include in your summary books. And the fourth thing that you need to do is have your vocabulary sheets open in front of you so that you can write into your vocabulary sheets the definitions of important terms or of any other words that you may be unfamiliar with. Once you've finished watching and taking notes on this video, please read the pages from the textbook referred to on this slide. And if you find any additional information from that reading that you think is useful, supplement your Cornell notes with that information. Here is the learning intention for the 2 videos. This is that you should be able to describe 2 of Porter's generic strategies for strategic management. And the 2 strategies that we're looking at are the lower cost strategy and the differentiation strategy. Please make sure that you have this learning intention in your Cornell notes. Now, Porter's strategies are referred to as generic strategies. Generic means applicable to all businesses. So these strategies that we're going to discuss can be used for businesses of all sizes, large, medium and small, in all different kinds of industries. That's why we refer to these strategies as Porter's generic strategies. Keep an eye open for the definitions of the terms that are set out on this slide. These are the definitions that you'll need to include in your vocabulary sheets. The focus of Porter's generic strategies is on how a business can gain a competitive advantage over other businesses in the same industry. So this is a very important concept to understand. We're looking here at strategies that give businesses a competitive advantage over their competitors. Now, according to Porter, there are 2 strategies that a business can adopt to gain a competitive advantage over its competitors. The first is the lower cost strategy. That means that the business has to be able to operate at a lower cost than any competitors. I want to emphasize here the word any. Under this strategy, it's important that the business is the lowest cost operator, not just a low cost operator. And that's because if it's only one of several low cost operators, then there is a risk that there'll be another business, another competitor, that is able to operate at a lower cost and therefore attract away the business's customers. So under this strategy, the focus is on the business becoming the lowest cost operator in the relevant market. The second strategy that a business can adopt is the differentiation strategy. Differentiation means selling a product, that is a good or a service, that is different from the product sold by any competitors. Again, I want to emphasize the word any. Under this strategy, for a business to gain a competitive advantage over its competitors, it must be selling a product that is different from the product that any of its competitors are selling. Put another way, that product must be unique, so that the only source of supply of that product is the business. Customers can't go anywhere else to get that product. You'll recall that the focus of Porter's generic strategies approach is on strategies that allow a business to obtain a competitive advantage over other businesses in the same industry. So it's necessary for the business to identify who its competitors are. That is, the business has to work out what its competitive scope is. There are two possible competitive scopes. First, the business could decide that it's competing against all businesses in the industry. In this case, the competitive scope is a wide market. So, for example, suppose we had a business that manufactures chocolate bars. That business, if they're adopting a wide market competitive scope, would see themselves as competing not just against other businesses that produce chocolate bars, but also against other businesses that produce snack foods. So that business could decide that it's competing against the manufacturers of chocolate bars, but also against the manufacturers of potato chips, jelly snakes, and other kinds of lollies. The second kind of competitive scope is a narrow market competitive scope. And if a business adopts this competitive scope, then it's deciding that it's only competing against some businesses in the industry. To take our chocolate bar producer example, if our chocolate bar producer adopts a narrow market competitive scope, then it is taking the view that it only competes against other businesses that produce and sell chocolate bars. This slide sets out in diagrammatic form what I've just described to you. Across the top we have the two strategies for a business to achieve a competitive advantage, that is, a lower cost strategy or a differentiation strategy. And down the left-hand side we have our competitive scope, that is, the business can either take the view that it's competing against a wide market, referred to here as a broad target, or against a narrow market, referred to here as a narrow target. When you look at all of these possible combinations, it means that there are 4 possible generic approaches or strategies that a business can take. It could decide to adopt a strategy to be the lowest cost producer in a wide market. This is referred to as a cost leadership strategy. That is, it's the strategy that is referred to in the top left-hand box. Alternatively, the business could take the view that it wants to become the lowest cost producer in a narrow market. In that case, it's said to adopt a cost focus strategy. That's the name given to the strategy in the left-hand box at the bottom. The business might, of course, decide to go for a differentiation strategy rather than a lowest cost strategy. In that case, it could decide to adopt a differentiation strategy in a wide market. That sort of strategy is just referred to as a differentiation strategy. That's the name given to the strategy in the box on the top right-hand side. Alternatively, the business could decide that its strategy is one of differentiation in a narrow market. And in that case, the strategy is called a differentiation focus strategy. That's the name given to that strategy in the right-hand box on the lower level. I don't want you to get too hung up with this kind of terminology. But what I do want you to understand is that there are basically 2 strategies for a business to achieve a competitive advantage, that is a lower cost strategy or a differentiation strategy, and that strategy can be applied either against a wide competitive scope, that is a wide market, or a narrow competitive scope, that is a narrow market. Now, before we come to look at these strategies in more detail, the business, of course, first has to determine which of these 4 generic approaches or strategies will it use. And there are 3 steps that a business must take to determine which is the most appropriate strategy. The first step is the business must apply a SWOT analysis to determine the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for each of those 4 strategies that it could adopt. The second step is that the business must use the 5-force analysis to determine the factors that affect the competitive power of the business. I'll be explaining this step in more detail later on. And the third step brings steps 1 and 2 together, in the sense that the business must then choose the strategy, that is, one of the 4 strategies, which gives it the best opportunity to either maximise its competitive power or minimise the factors that reduce its competitive power. Again, remember that Porter's generic strategies are all focused on how a business can obtain a competitive advantage. So we're looking at a strategy that gives the business the best opportunity to maximise its competitive power, that is, obtain the maximum competitive advantage it can, or else how it can choose a strategy that gives it the opportunity to minimise the factors that reduce its competitive power, that is, minimise the factors that reduce its competitive advantage. Now, in the next couple of slides, we'll look at what a 5-force analysis is, because this really is the critical step for us. Again, what we're looking at here is what factors affect the competitive power or competitive advantage that a business may obtain. And that's important because, of course, as I say, Porter's strategies are all about trying to maximise competitive advantage. So you want to maximise your competitive power, or at least minimise the factors that reduce your competitive power. This slide summarises the 5 forces: the bargaining power of suppliers, the bargaining power of customers, competitive rivalry within an industry, the threat of new entrants, and the threat of substitute products. Let's look at each of those in turn. Let's now look at each of these 5 forces in detail. Remember that we're looking at these 5 forces because we want to understand what forces affect the competitive power of our business. The first force is supplier power. Supplier power is the power of suppliers to increase the price of inputs used by the business to produce the product. So let's suppose that you operate a business which has one supplier of a very important input. In that case, the supplier power is very high, because if that supplier was to increase the price of that input, you would have no choice except to pay that higher price, because you rely on that input to produce your product. So that's a case where the supplier power is very high, and as a result, the competitive power of your business is very low. The second force is buyer power. Buyer power is the power of buyers to drive down the price of the product sold by the business. So again, let's assume that you're operating in a business and you only have one customer. There's only one buyer for your product. If that buyer was to leave you and was to buy its product from one of your competitors, then you can see that you'd be out of business. You no longer have someone that you can sell your product to. So in that case, we say that the buyer power is very high, and the corresponding position is that the competitive power of your business is very low. The third force is competitive rivalry. Competitive rivalry is the degree of competition in the market from other businesses. Let's suppose that you operate a business and that you're competing with 20 other businesses in the market. In that case, the degree of competitive rivalry is very high. If one of your competitors undercuts your prices or produces a better quality product, then many of your customers are going to leave you and go to your competitors. So again, that's a situation of high competitive rivalry, which translates into low competitive power for your business. The fourth force is the threat of substitution. The threat of substitution is the ability of buyers to swap to a different product that satisfies their needs. Now let's take an example. Let's suppose that you operate a business that sells margarine. In that case, one of the products that competes with margarine is butter. They can be both used as spreads on bread or on toast. And they both have different tastes, and appeal to different customers, but essentially they are very similar products. You face the threat of substitution in the sense that if you increase the price at which you sell your margarine, then many of your customers will change, and they'll change out of margarine and buy butter from one of your competitors. So where you've got a product which is very similar to the product that you are selling, then the threat of substitution is very high, and that translates into low competitive power of the business. The final force is the threat of new entry. The threat of new entry is the ability of other businesses to enter the market and compete with your business. If you are operating a business in a market that other businesses can enter at very low cost, then you face a substantial threat of new entry. So, for example, you might be operating a milk bar in a particular suburb. It's not very expensive to establish a milk bar. If you increase the prices of the products that you sell through your milk bar, then there's a risk that another person will set up a milk bar just around the corner, and that won't cost them much money. They just have to rent a shop, buy some products, and they'll be able to compete with you. In that case, there's a high threat of new entry, and there's a corresponding low competitive power of your business. We can use a real-life example to demonstrate the application of five-force analysis. The example that I have chosen for this purpose is that of Jetstar, which is a low-budget airline that operates in Australia and is owned by Qantas. Jetstar's main competitor is another Australian budget airline whose name is Tiger Air. Tiger Air is actually owned by Virgin Blue. Now, one of the major costs for any airline is the cost of aviation fuel, that is the fuel that its planes use. There are only 4 suppliers of aviation fuel in Australia. These are Caltex, BP, ExxonMobil and Shell. The company that supplies aviation fuel to Jetstar is currently Caltex. Let's analyse this example referring to each of the 5 forces that we've looked at so far. The first force is supplier power. In this case, if our aviation fuel suppliers, that is Caltex, BP, ExxonMobil and Shell, increase the price at which they sell aviation fuel to airlines in Australia, then Jetstar will have little option except to pay that higher price. It has no one else it can buy aviation fuel from. So this is a case where supplier power is very high, with the result that Jetstar has quite low competitive power. The second force that we looked at is buyer power. Now, passengers will travel on budget airlines because they want cheap flights. Passengers have very high buyer power because they will only travel with Jetstar if it has cheaper flights than Tiger Air. If Jetstar's ticketed prices are higher than Tiger Air's ticketed prices, it is highly likely that these very price-conscious passengers will switch from Jetstar to Tiger Air. Again, this is an example where there is very high buyer power, with the result that Jetstar has very low competitive power. The third force is competitive rivalry. As I've explained, there's considerable competition between Jetstar and Tiger Air for budget passengers. Budget passengers are very price conscious, they're not very loyal to any particular airline, they are just after the cheapest ticket. And therefore there's a lot of competition between Jetstar and Tiger Air to offer the cheapest flights. This is a case where competitive rivalry is high, even though there are only 2 airlines operating in the industry, and correspondingly Jetstar's competitive power is very low. The fourth force is the threat of substitution. It's very easy for Jetstar passengers to switch from travelling Jetstar to Tiger Air. All they have to do is buy a ticket with Tiger Air. Alternatively, because we're talking about airlines operating within Australia, it's quite possible that a Jetstar passenger, faced with an increase in prices by Jetstar, might choose not to fly at all, but instead to travel interstate by bus or train rather than plane. So again, here is a case where the threat of substitution, either to another airline or to another form of transport, is very high, which means that Jetstar has very low competitive power. The final force that we need to look at is the threat of new entry. In this case, it's very costly to establish an airline. So there is not a very high threat of new entry into the budget airline industry. To establish a new airline, you'll need to buy or rent planes, which is very expensive. You'll need to negotiate arrangements with airports so that you can land and take your planes off. And you'll also need to set up all of the infrastructure that is required to operate an airline, such as ticketing booths and employees. Employees who will be employed both in the ticketing arrangements, in the back office, and also, of course, on the planes. So this is a case where the threat of new entry is actually very low, and correspondingly it means that Jetstar will have a higher degree of competitive power than it would have if the threat of new entry was very high. This table illustrates the factors that affect the competitive power of a business. You should now be able to describe what each of the forces is. These are the 5 forces that are listed in the left-hand column of the table. However, in addition, you need to be able to do 2 further things. The first thing is that you need to be able to describe the factors that determine the strength of each of these forces. These factors are listed in the right-hand column of the table. The second thing that you need to be able to do is to describe the effect that these factors, that is the factors in the right-hand column of the table, have on the competitive power of a business. I will be describing these effects on the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the table as we move through this slide. The first force that we looked at was supplier power. The main factor that affects the strength of supplier power is the number of suppliers of the inputs that the business uses. The competitive power of a business will generally be higher if there are lots of input suppliers. That's because if the business becomes dissatisfied with its current input supplier, for example, because that input supplier increases the price of its inputs, then that business will have a number of other suppliers for those inputs that it can choose from. So it's got lots of other options from whom it can buy the inputs that it needs. Conversely, the competitive power of a business will generally be lower if there are few input suppliers. In that case, if all of the input suppliers decide, for example, to increase their price, then the business will have little option but to pay that increased price. It doesn't have other suppliers that it can go to for cheaper inputs. The second force that we looked at was buyer power. The main factors that affect the strength of buyer power are the number and size of buyers of the product, and also the cost to those buyers of switching out of the products produced by the business to the products produced by a competitor of the business. The competitive power of a business will generally be higher if there are lots of buyers of the business's products. That's because if a couple of buyers choose to switch to a competitor, then that's not going to worry the business too much. It's still got plenty of other buyers that it can sell its product to. Similarly, if the cost to a buyer of switching from the business to a competitor is very high, then that customer, that buyer, is going to be fairly unwilling to switch unless, for example, the business increases its prices dramatically. We call those buyers sticky because they're going to be reluctant to move from the business to a competitor of the business because it costs them a lot of money to do that. Conversely, the competitive power of a business will generally be lower if there are few buyers of the business's products. In that case, those buyers have a lot of power. They might require the business to reduce the prices at which it sells its products to them. Otherwise, they will simply leave and go to a competitor of the business. again, if the price of, or if the cost rather, of buyers switching from the products produced by the business to the products produced by a competitor is very low, then that also will mean that the competitive power of the business is low, because it doesn't cost much for the buyers simply to move from the business to a competitor of the business. The third force that we looked at was competitive rivalry. The main factors that affect the strength of competitive rivalry are the number of competitors that the business competes with, and also the attractiveness of those competitors' products to buyers. The competitive power of a business will generally be higher if there are few competitors. That is, if there are few options for buyers to switch to if they are unhappy with the business. Similarly, if the business produces a particularly attractive product, that is one that has features that are particularly valued by the buyers, then again they are going to be less willing to switch to a product produced by a competitor, even if they're not so happy with the business, for example, because the business increases the price of its product. In that case, the competitive power of the business is high. Conversely, the competitive power of a business will generally be lower if there are lots of competitors. If there are lots of competitors, that is, lots of firms that compete with the business, then those people who buy products from the business will have lots of options to switch to if they become dissatisfied with the business. That'll particularly be the case if the products which are offered by the competitors of the business are fairly similar to the products which are offered by the business. That is, if there's no real difference in the attractiveness of the products of the business and the products of competitors of the business. The fourth power that we looked at was the threat of substitution. The main factor that affects the strength of the threat of substitution is the existence of alternative products at a similar price. The competitive power of a business will generally be higher if there are no alternative products. In that situation, if customers want to buy a particular product, the only source of that product is the business. So even if the business increases its prices and the customers are not particularly happy with that, they still will have no other place that they can get the products that they want. Conversely, the competitive power of a business will generally be lower if there are alternative products. If customers of the business are able to get similar products from competitors of the business, then they have options into which they can switch if they become dissatisfied with the business and its product offering. The fifth and final force that we looked at is the threat of new entry. The main factor that affects the strength of the threat of new entry are the size of barriers to entry. Barriers to entry refers to how hard it is for a competitor to enter into the market and compete against the business. There may be high barriers to entry if the cost of establishing a new business is very high, or if the regulatory requirements that a business that's entering the market has to comply with are very onerous, or if it's necessary to have a skilled workforce to be able to compete in a particular industry. Think back to the example of Jetstar. In that case, the barriers to entry for a competitor seeking to enter into the budget airline industry are very high. It's very costly to establish a new airline because you have to buy or rent planes, and you have to pay fees to airports so that you can land and take off your planes. There are substantial regulatory requirements that a new airline must satisfy. Particularly, it'll need to satisfy the airline regulators that its planes are properly maintained and are safe. And to operate an airline, you require a skilled workforce. You need pilots who are qualified to fly your planes. So that's an example where the barriers to entry to a competitor are very high, and so there is a very low threat of new entry. In that circumstance, we say that the competitive power of a business will generally be higher if there are high barriers to entry. However, there are many industries that it's very easy to enter into. That is where the barriers to entry are low. I've already described to you the position of opening a milk bar. It's actually fairly cheap to open a milk bar. You just need to be able to rent. You don't even need to buy. You can just rent a shop that you can use as a milk bar. There are very few regulatory requirements. You certainly have to comply with food handling requirements. You have to keep your milk refrigerated, for example, but those are not difficult or expensive requirements to comply with. And finally, you don't need a skilled workforce to operate a milk bar. You just need someone who's able to sell the milk bar products to customers. So the competitive power of a business will generally be lower if there are low barriers to entry. Now I'll give you two examples of how a business could apply the 3 steps we've looked at, including the 5-force analysis in step 2, to determine which of Porter's generic strategies the business should adopt so as to gain a competitive advantage over its competitors. The first example is of Costless, which is an international clothing retailer that has established a business in Australia which focuses on selling affordable everyday clothing. Step 1 is to use a SWOT analysis to determine the relevant strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. Let's suppose that a major strength of Costless is that it has an established relationship with businesses in Asia that manufacture cheap clothing, and that a weakness of Costless is that it has a reputation for selling low-quality clothes. Step 2 is to use the 5-force analysis to determine the factors that affect the competitive power of Costless. Let's suppose that supplier power is low because there are a large number of businesses in Asia that manufacture cheap clothing, so that Costless could swap to new suppliers if its existing suppliers increased their prices. This is a force that strengthens Costless's competitive power. However, there are 2 forces that weaken Costless's competitive power. First, buyer power is high because Costless's customers have little loyalty and will shop wherever they can get the cheapest clothing. And second, there is high competitive rivalry because there are already a large number of cheap clothing retailers, such as Kmart and Target, who operate in Australia. Step 3 is to decide whether a lower cost approach or a differentiation approach gives Costless the best opportunity to maximise its competitive power. In this case, a differentiation approach is unlikely to be successful. This is because a weakness of Costless is that it has a reputation for low-quality clothing, and it'll be very difficult for Costless to change this reputation so that it becomes a high-quality clothing retailer. In addition, there is high buyer power and high competitive rivalry. What this means is that Costless's customers are very price conscious and so will not be willing to pay for higher quality clothing and therefore higher priced clothing. If Costless does try to sell higher quality and therefore higher priced clothing, then its customers will simply switch to buying their clothes from one of Costless's lower cost competitors. On the other hand, Costless's strength is that it can access cheap clothes from Asia, which means that it can afford to sell those clothes at a low price. In addition, there is low supplier power, which means that Costless can drive down the price at which it buys its clothes from its existing Asian suppliers because it can threaten to buy clothes from their competitors if they do not sell the clothes to Costless at the lowest available prices. This strength of Costless in being able to buy cheap clothes from Asia, combined with low supplier power, suggests that a lower cost approach would be most appropriate. Because Costless is competing against clothing retailers across Australia, this lower cost approach will be the cost leadership strategy. The second example is of Premchoc, which is a small business that specialises in the production of handmade chocolates. Step 1 is to use a SWOT analysis to determine the relevant strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. Let's suppose that a major strength of Premchoc is that it has an established reputation as a producer of high-quality chocolates, and that a weakness of Premchoc is that it has high costs, in particular because it must pay skilled staff to make the chocolates and because it doesn't mass-produce the chocolates using machinery. Step 2 is to use the 5-force analysis to determine the factors that affect the competitive power of Premchoc. Let's suppose that buyer power and the threat of substitution are high, because customers can easily buy chocolates from other chocolate producers, and because, instead of buying handmade chocolates, customers could switch to buying other luxury sweets like small handmade chocolate eclairs and tarts. These are forces that weaken Premchoc's competitive power. However, let's also suppose that there is a low threat of new entry because, to produce handmade chocolates, it's necessary to employ skilled staff, and there's a serious shortage of skilled chocolate makers who are available for employment. This is a force that strengthens Premchoc's competitive power. Step 3 is to decide whether a lower cost approach or a differentiation approach gives Premchoc the best opportunity to maximise its competitive power. In this case, a lower cost approach is unlikely to be successful because Premchoc has relatively high costs and it risks ruining its reputation if it substitutes machine-made chocolates for handmade chocolates. However, Premchoc needs to adopt an approach that will result in customers being willing to buy its chocolates despite the fact that those customers could easily buy cheaper chocolates elsewhere and could easily buy other luxury sweets instead of Premchoc's chocolates. In these circumstances, a differentiation approach would be most appropriate. If Premchoc can establish a reputation for itself as providing the highest quality chocolates for special occasions, then customers are likely to be willing to buy chocolates from Premchoc for those special occasions, despite the price of those chocolates being higher than the price of chocolates sold by Premchoc's competitors. Because Premchoc is a small business, it probably only competes against chocolate producers in, say, the Melbourne market, and so this differentiation approach will be the differentiation focus strategy. That now brings us to the end of part 1 of Porter's generic strategies. Remember, the learning intention is that you need to be able to describe 2 of Porter's generic strategies for strategic management. We're going to be looking in depth at these 2 strategies in part 2 of this video. So please make sure that you watch part 2 and that you take notes on part 2. You should also make sure that you read chapter 12 of the book so that you can supplement the notes that you've taken so far with any new information that you find useful from reading chapter 12. Alright, thank you, and I look forward to you joining me for part 2 of this video.